Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a beautiful day. It turned out to be beautiful. It was rather overcast this morning. It's cool and a bit damp, but it's very, very pretty out there, and much cooler than it was yesterday. We hit the 70s yesterday here in Appalachia. Today, I think we'll be lucky to get up to the mid-50s. In fact, it's rather chilly out there, but it's a beautiful day overhead, beautiful puffy white clouds, and it's a gorgeous day. I hope that your day is going well. This is our second program this week. Today is Tuesday. It's the 12th day of April in the year 2016, and it sure is a pleasure to be with you once again here at the Virtual Center. We look forward to hearing from you. We would love to hear from you and hear your thoughts and your ideas on some of the issues that we have kind of thrown out for your consideration here at the Virtual Center. Yesterday, spent quite a bit of time in the first portion of the program on the two-party system, went back over the two-party aspects of the Washington's farewell address. And, of course, I mean, one of the issues, of course, is that there's really no acceptance of two parties in the farewell address, and we pretty much dealt with that. And then toward the end of the program, about the last half hour or so, we dealt with the foreign policy aspects of Washington's farewell address. And I'd like to pick up today with just going back and touching a little bit on those foreign policy aspects. And we didn't have time to really get into, it seems to me, the significance, the implications of what Washington had to say about foreign policy. We spent most of our time just trying to get the information on the record, so to speak. So I'd like to begin today's program by going back and touching a little bit on the farewell address, the foreign policy aspects of the farewell address. Then, as I mentioned, I believe I mentioned yesterday, and if I didn't, I apologize because I meant to. I'd like to. There was a pretty interesting piece in the New York Times, a review of the musical Hamilton, which is taking Broadway by storm, as many of you know, and the person who wrote it and stars in it as Alexander Hamilton has been getting accolades all over the place, and historians are now beginning to look at the play and look at the treatment of Alexander Hamilton in the play, and have a number of things to say. I thought it was a pretty good piece, and I'd like to share a few thoughts about that with you as well today. And then finally, if we do have the time, and I hope we do, there was a significant article in Sunday's New York Times on the Glass-Steagall Act. A lot of us have heard discussions and debates of late about Glass-Steagall. And this particular article goes through the origins of that law, why it was passed, what it was designed to do, what indeed it has done, and why the raps, so to speak, created by Glass-Steagall were taken off. And there's a lot of pressure being applied now to reinstitute something like Glass-Steagall. And one of the major advocates of Glass-Steagall right now is Bernie Sanders. So I'd like to touch on aspects of that article. It gets into some pretty sophisticated investment and economic information, which may be a little bit beyond my pay grade in certain areas, but I'd like to at least give it a try, because I think the more of this material and information we get on the record, so to speak, it gives people the kind of information that they need in order to make decisions, ask questions, and if sufficiently interested, the opportunity to pursue even more information and conduct a little bit of private research on it. We would love to hear from you on your thoughts and your ideas on some of the issues that we've been dealing with here at the Virtual Center. We do have a phone number, and it's there primarily in order to get you on the air so that you can share your thoughts and your ideas, your questions, your concerns, your suggestions, whatever, with our listeners. Remember, it's not just me that you're talking about. It's the people who rely on this program and look to it to secure some of the information on the origins of the Constitution and the implications of that Constitution as it affects our day-to-day lives here in the 21st century. The phone area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And, of course, as we've mentioned numerous times, 4676 on your keypad, horn, H-O. If you remember more that way, then let me repeat it that way. 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to drop me an email and share your thoughts or your concerns, ideas, or whatever in an email, I would love to hear from you, and I will make every effort in the world to respond to you. If you take the time to send me a substantive email, then it seems to me, if I can, I owe you a substantive response, and I'll do the best I can to comply with that commitment. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And again, I do call your attention to our Facebook page. This past weekend, I put an article on America's two. I did post it on Facebook. I have submitted it to our Charleston Gazette here in West Virginia for publication. I received acknowledgement that the article was received. Whether in fact it'll be published or not, we'll have to wait and see. But the article that I did submit is on Facebook. If you go to the Facebook homepage and in the search box you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Virtual Center Facebook page, and the very first entry on that will be this particular article on two parties. It seemed, as I recall, the title of the article suggests the transition in part. It's related something like the transition in parties from problem to solution, or something to that effect. And of course, the implication of the title is the transition from parties as a negative to what ultimately becomes parties as a positive. And of course, as we know today, the parties as a positive portion of our two-party system and its long history is pretty much in trouble right now, given the polarization that has overtaken our political system in this year of the 2016 primary season, which is absolutely incredible. It seems to me the number of articles and different perspectives on this current campaign on both sides of the aisle, it seems to me, is seemingly endless. This campaign is raising so many issues, and it's revealing so many of the inner operations of our political system that many people suspected were there, had always suspected were there, but never could put their finger on. Now they're becoming exposed for all the public to see. And it's hard to predict what the final outcome of this is going to be. I think the conventions are looming, the July conventions, to be momentous events in a lot of ways. And of course, it's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen because those things are a couple of months away at this point. Anyway, welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center. As I mentioned, I'd like to begin today's program by going back to the last part of yesterday's program, more specifically looking at the foreign policy implications of Washington's farewell address. You'll recall that we closed our program yesterday by addressing some statement at Washington. And one of the things that Washington made very clear in his farewell address, and of course, keep in mind that that Alexander Hamilton is the architect, is the origin of this stuff. But on the other hand, obviously, it fit into Washington's priorities, or he wouldn't have adopted it. President Washington's argument at the time, 1796, of course, has focused for the most part of his address on the dangers of parties. And what he's basically looking at is the emergent Republican opposition to his administration and to the policies and programs of his administration, the key ones being, of course, the financial recommendations of Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. And after devoting 75-80% of his farewell address to the issues of parties, Washington goes into the final major issue of his address, which is the foreign policy aspect of the recommendations that he has for the nation. And what he's most specifically concerned about, and this is the issue that probably gets most of the attention when people mention Washington's farewell address, is the warning to the nation about the dangers of so-called entangling alliances, treaty obligations which tie the United States to the priorities of other nations. And President Washington is warning against the dangers of those so-called entangling alliances because they eliminate our flexibility in our own foreign policy. They make it difficult for the United States to maintain the kinds of decision-making and the kinds of choices that are necessary in order to conduct an effective foreign policy. And one of the things that Washington presumes throughout his section on foreign policy, and I think one of the things that all of us need to take very seriously, is the following, and this is my own. This is not in Washington's farewell address. This is my own observation, but I think it's very, very important to keep in mind. I think we all know it, but every once in a while, it's important to remind ourselves of it. And that is that nations do not conduct foreign policy for the benefit of anybody else except themselves. I know that sounds almost so obvious that it sometimes causes us to wonder why, in fact, we even mention it at all. But the fact of the matter is it's very important when nations make decisions affecting foreign policy, they do it always because the decision reached is seen as the best option for the nation that makes that particular decision. Nations conduct foreign policy for their own benefit, not for the benefit of others. Other nations, other peoples. And the reason that it's important to mention this is because there has been this myth throughout much of American history, and as our students read in their textbooks, there oftentimes is the suggestion in our textbooks that the United States, America, is the only nation that conducts foreign policy for the benefit of the world, and that we basically see ourselves as representing the best interests of all mankind, and that therefore the things that we advocate in our diplomacy are things that all nations would best buy into. And of course, the implication of that is that we are the only nation that conducts foreign policy for everybody else's benefit except our own. In terms of foreign aid, in terms of disaster aid, many people will point out that when there's a disaster, a natural disaster, whether it be hurricanes, tornadoes, typhoons, or whatever, earthquakes or whatever, the United States is usually the first nation there with aid. And so the implication is that this says something about us, that we are unlike other peoples of the world in that we have the best interests of mankind at heart all the time. I'm not totally denying that portions of that are true. There's no question that we are and have been traditionally one of the more generous nations in the world. But it's also important to recognize that we have traditionally been one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And that has made it possible for us to do things that others can't do. But the fact of the matter is, it's important to recognize that whatever we do, whatever decision we make in foreign policy, there is always a self-interest aspect of it. There's always a perspective associated with what we do that suggests that it benefits us as well. Of course, the ideal would be a win-win situation for everybody, where it benefits us, but it benefits everybody else as well. And of course, that's the ideal. But the fact of the matter is, we are not going to conduct foreign policy that is contrary to our public interest, to our national interest. And I think that makes sense. And that's every nation obviously operates on that kind of an agenda. I think it's important to keep that in mind. And again, part of the problem here is that our textbooks have created the illusion that the United States of America is the only nation in the world, in the history of the world, which conducts foreign policy for the benefit of everybody else, whether in fact it benefits us or not. And we need to look seriously at that, because that assumption is flawed. President Washington's farewell address and his warning about entangling alliances, as we saw yesterday in looking at the farewell address, is clearly based on the assumption that entangling alliances limit our options. They take away our flexibility. They make it impossible for us to operate in our own best interests. So therefore, we have to be very careful about such entangling alliances. And President Washington goes into even more detail than that. And he points out that we have to be very careful not to become overly enamored with certain nations, certain cultures, or overly suspicious and antagonistic to others. A danger for our nation and its best interests will usually follow when we tend to believe that certain nations have more in common with us than other nations, therefore they are our natural allies. Whereas other nations, which may have a history of being antagonists of ours, have established a reputation where they deserve permanent suspicion as enemies of ours. And Washington points out that in both of those cases, there's a danger that being overly friendly to certain nations or overly antagonistic to other nations can backfire against us. We have to basically maintain our flexibility, Washington says. We have to be able to do what best suits us at particular points in time. It may be that the situation will arise where we're going to have to take a position against the nation we usually are allied with. And in fact, we may end up, Washington implies, lining up with nations that we are often antagonistic toward. It depends on the situation at a given point in time. And that's Washington's point. We need to maintain the in our own best interests. It's very obvious that Washington's farewell address is written at a point in historical time. It is time sensitive. And what that means is it's early in the nation's history. And in this early period of the nation's history, when the United States of America is just trying to get its bearings and build its foundations for a glorious future, that's the reason why neutrality is at that point in time the best policy. Washington's suggestion is that it would be counterproductive for us to tie ourselves to other nations and thereby become slaves to decisions that they make in the international sphere. We must maintain our flexibility and our ability to make our own decisions in our own best interests. And at that point in time, Washington makes the case that neutrality seems to be the best policy for this new nation, for the United States. But Washington makes very clear toward the end of his address that this neutrality idea is projected to be temporary. That what this is contingent on is our ability to strengthen ourselves and to build up our position, our reputation, and our power to the point that we become a major player on the world stage. At that point, our foreign policy priorities might be different. Washington implies then that the United States may be a weak partner at this point in relationship to some of the other major nations of the world. But he is anticipating that that situation is not going to persist, and that at some point in time, the United States of America is going to be powerful enough to exert itself in international affairs in ways that it is not currently, as of 1796, able to do. What Washington, of course, is most concerned about at that point in time is the 1778 alliance that the United States entered into with France during the American Revolution. In order to win independence, the United States obligated itself by treaty with France. And when we get to the 1790s and France and England go to war, France naturally expects the United States to honor its treaty obligations by supporting her in her war against Great Britain. But at that point in time, with a nation brand new under the Constitution, the last thing that Washington or any of the other leaders of the nation want is for the United States to be dragged into a European war when our priorities are primarily to build our own strength and our own security and our own stability, and not allow the winds of European diplomacy to suck us into international events which don't serve our best interests. So Washington makes the decision in April of 1793 to issue his famous proclamation of neutrality in the war between England and France. And of course, it's important to look at that statement of neutrality from the perspectives of both England and France, which are at war with each other. For France, that believes it has a treaty obligation with us to join her in her struggles with Great Britain, Washington's proclamation of neutrality is to France a violation of the United States' treaty obligation. From Great Britain's point of view, it's a victory. And I think one of the things that historians have revealed over the years in research is that there's absolutely no question that Alexander Hamilton was intricately involved in some of the relationships with Great Britain during this period, and that Federalist policy was very, very strong on the side of not abiding by the treaty with France, not going to war with Great Britain in order to support France, because Hamilton and those he spoke for believed that the commercial and financial future of the United States depended on good relationships with Great Britain because of the wealth and power of her worldwide empire. And that all things being equal, our future would be much better off doing business with Great Britain than it would be by going to war with Great Britain. So there's no question that the Hamilton influence on this particular decision is telling. I think that these are some of the implications of the foreign policy aspects of Washington's farewell address. Let me suggest to you just a couple of conclusions, food for thought, so to speak. I think the first thing that we can draw from this is that Washington is coming down hard on the side of American self-interest in its foreign policy deliberations and decisions. Nowhere is there any suggestion in Washington's farewell address that the United States of America should adhere to a particular policy or a particular philosophy in conducting foreign policy. Rather, the implication is clear that Washington is advocating the particular reading of American self-interest at the time as being the principal determinant as to what we do in our relations with other nations. Self-interest, not the public interest, not the interests of mankind, not the welfare of the world's population, but our own national self-interest, which puts us in the same category as other nations. We are not, and Washington did not even suggest that we are a nation that is willing to forfeit its self-interest for the benefits of mankind. We'd like to believe that, many of us, for religions and moral purposes, many of us who believe that we are the leader in the moral direction of the world, that we should stand for something different and more noble than other nations. But the fact of the matter is, Washington never said that. Washington never veered from the idea that our reading of our own self-interest should dictate our foreign policy, whatever that decision might be at a particular point in time. And therefore, in order to maintain the flexibility to do that, Washington was very concerned about entangling alliances, about getting involved in treaties with other nations that minimized or restricted our flexibility and made it difficult to pursue our own self-interest. To be very blunt about it, the treaty with France of 1778, while it seemed to be the right thing to do at the time, tied America's hands in the 1790s. It became an embarrassment for the Washington administration because that particular treaty ran counter to the way we read the best interests of this nation at that time, which was to maintain a close commercial relationship with Great Britain. So there was a contradiction in the 90s between what was best for us and what we were obligated to do from 20 years earlier. 18 years earlier to be accurate. And Washington made the decision that the best way to wiggle out of that is with the proclamation of neutrality. But he makes it very clear that that neutrality is not our official foreign policy position either. At that point in time, neutrality is to our best interest. But Washington doesn't believe for a moment, and says so, that that's always going to be the case. What is always going to be the case is our self-interest. And I think that's very, very significant to keep in mind. When studies of foreign policy were academic and intellectual priorities in this country, which I believe was true up until the Vietnam War, universities with very strong history departments, very strong history programs, research programs, always made it a point to employ one or more foreign policy diplomatic experts on their faculty, on their staff. Foreign policy was considered to be a major research focus of a well-rounded history department. And that was true up through and including World War II. But it seems to me that Vietnam changed everything. And more specifically, I believe that one of the individuals most responsible for changing everything was the diplomatic historian William Appleman Williams. And Williams is considered to be one of the foremost scholars in the history of American foreign policy. The problem was, at the time of Vietnam, that the research and the papers and the books that Williams was responsible for, and the graduate students that he supervised, students that he was churning out into some of the major colleges and universities in the world, made it very difficult for some people to defend America's behavior in the world. In 1959, William Appleman Williams published probably his most famous book, titled The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. And in that book, Williams explained why he believed American foreign policy throughout its history had been somewhat of a tragedy. And the focus, of course, is what he meant by tragedy. Why? What about American foreign policy constituted tragedy to Williams? Williams believed that the tragedy aspect of American foreign policy is to be found in the contradictions, the hypocrisy, if you will, of that foreign policy. Because at the same time that the United States of America was preaching its commitment to individual freedom, choice, opportunity, and all that went with it, we were conducting foreign policy which denied those very principles to the peoples of the world that we were involved with diplomatically. In other words, we were saying one thing and doing something else. We were talking the talk, but we weren't walking the walk. At the same time that we were preaching individual freedom to all the peoples of the world as a human right, we were engaged in foreign policy that oftentimes put us in a position of supporting governments that were abusing their own peoples, that were denying their own peoples the freedom and the opportunities and the values that American spokesmen touted as being so important and so critical to America's mission in the world. We were operating at cross purposes, Williams argued. While we advocated a policy of free and open trade, commercial freedom, open markets, the free market, as it were, the buying and selling of goods and services among free nations of the world, we were using our commercial and manufacturing strength to deny those kinds of decisions and that kind of flexibility to the nations with whom we were partnering. I apologize for the phone in the background. I had an answering machine that took it, but the voice will stop in a moment. Williams points to the late 19th century and the aftermath of the so-called Spanish-American War in 1898 as being the most telling, visible example of what American foreign policy priorities were all about. Specifically, the United States was confronted after the Spanish-American War with the issue of the Philippines. In defeating Spain in 1898, we were responsible for freeing Spanish possessions around the world, one of them being the Philippines. And there's no question that a significant movement within the Philippines, led by an insurgent did everything it could do to support America's efforts against Spain. Because, and this man's name was Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo realized that if the United States was successful in defeating Spain, this would result in freedom for the Philippine people. So Aguinaldo and his forces took up the cause and supported America's efforts in its war against Spain. After the war was over, the United States was confronted with a decision about the Philippines. Do we allow the Philippines to be free, or do we take possession of the Philippines? And there's a very famous quote by President McKinley, who talks about pacing the floor of the White House night after night, trying to make this difficult decision. And he goes through the process of elimination and says, we couldn't allow the Philippines to be totally independent because they weren't ready for independence. They were incapable of freedom. They weren't well educated and developed enough to be able to handle freedom. And so leaving them on their own would be the worst thing, would be the most inhuman thing we could do. So McKinley finally comes to the conclusion that the best thing, the Christian thing to do, is to take the Philippines, educate the Philippine people. But the fact of the matter is, the hardcore self-interest of the United States at the time demanded that we take the Philippines because the Philippines gave us direct entry into the burgeoning market in China. And the major commercial and industrial nations of the world were competing with each other for markets, for trade with China. Most of them controlled pieces of China, so-called spheres of influence. The only major nation at the end of the 19th century that did not have a sphere of influence in China was the United States. And to let that situation go on meant that while the nations of the world were competing with each other for access to the China market, which was huge and potentially so lucrative, the United States would be ousted, would be eliminated from that competition because we did not have a sphere of influence. The lack of a sphere of influence was compensated by our possession of the Philippines. It gave us direct access to the China market and thereby made us a player in competition for trade in China. So there's our self-interest showing its head, as it were. Once we got into the China market, then the question became, what is the best way to organize China in such a way that it benefits everybody, including us? In other words, what can we do which would seem to be a win for everybody? And in response to that question, to that dilemma, John Hay, America's Secretary of State, drafts the first set of so-called open door notes. And the formal declaration of America's open door policy is born. To William Appleman Williams, the open door policy is the rationale for America's determination to industrially and to commercially control the world. We would become the dominant power in the world, Hay believed, because in a free and open competition where all the markets of the world were open for competition among the major powers, Hay and others believed that the United States could outperform and dominate such competition. Given open and free opportunity to compete with other nations, Hay and others had faith that the United States would be able to outcompete all the other nations of the world. So consequently, he drafted the open door notes, which asked all the other nations with spheres of influence in China to commit to the principle of free and open trade, open doors, where everybody could compete with everybody else, which for us was our best shot at dominating the world economically. The only nation that didn't benefit from the open door policy in China was China. China was the victim of this policy. China was the carcass on which all the major nations were trying to agree on rules for devouring the carcass of China. In other words, the exploiters were trying to agree on common rules of behavior so that all of them could exploit China without fighting with each other over it. The only partner that didn't have a voice in this was China itself. Naturally, the Chinese responded. They didn't like it. They felt that they were being exploited, taken advantage of, that their culture was not being valued or appreciated. And so the decision amongst underground groups in China was rebellion, was to commit themselves to throwing out all the Westerners out of China and preserving China for the Chinese. John Hay and the other leaders of major nations realized that if China was successful in ousting all the Western powers, then they would all lose. They would all suffer from the loss of a lucrative China market. Consequently, the major powers were able to come together and reach agreement on crushing the Chinese rebellion, which historians refer to and call themselves the Boxer Rebellion. I was stuck there for a moment for the name. Many of us will remember the Boxer Rebellion. I can remember when I was growing up, a teenager, there was a movie that came out in the 1950s called 55 Days in Peking, starring Burt Lancaster. Until I went to college, I actually believed that Burt Lancaster put down the Boxer Rebellion all by himself. But the fact of the matter is, the Western powers were able to create an international force to crush the Boxers, to lay China low in order that she would remain a victim for exploitation by the major powers. What we are seeing here is an open example of the differences between the developed world and the underdeveloped world in response to the Industrial Revolution. The industrial nations of the world, the West, had products to sell, industrial products to sell. China had no industry. What she did have was a lucrative potential market to buy these manufactured goods. It was a perfect situation for the Western nations. The concern was, and again, this comes back to John Hay, Secretary of State. The concern was that the violence of the Boxer Rebellion so angered European powers that they were more committed than ever not only to crushing the Boxers, but to defining much more precisely their spheres of influence. In other words, each of these foreign nations was determined to secure its hold, its footing in China in its sphere of influence. John Hay worried that if nations became too focused on their sphere of influence, then that could work to the detriment of the United States because we didn't have a sphere of influence. Our commercial success in China depended on the spheres of influence of other nations being open to us to do business. So to John Hay, it became more critical than ever to get these nations to affirm, once again, their commitment to the principle of the open door, free and open trade for everybody. Nations would have their spheres of influence, but everybody could do business in everybody else's sphere. And that basically becomes the second set of open door notes, where John Hay seeks to get the major powers to reaffirm their commitment to the principle of the open door, free and open trade for everybody. And there's one other provision in the second set of open door notes that is critical to this. And that is that all nations were asked by John Hay in the second open door note to affirm a commitment to the territorial integrity of China. The last thing that the United States wanted was for Western countries, in their vindictiveness towards the Boxers, to carve China up into pieces, into colonies. Because if that happened, we would be left out in the cold. The only way that we could maintain our opportunities, commercial opportunities in China, was if the major powers who had spheres of influence there were willing to commit to A, the principle of the open door, and B, preserving the territorial integrity of China. China would remain one entity, one nation, as it were. China would have its emperor. He would be the figurehead head of China. But because China was powerless to do anything to protect itself, the Western nations together would be calling the political and economic shots in China. In other words, preserving the territorial integrity of China guaranteed that China would not be carved up into colonies, which would be against our open door interests. And at the same time, that China would be ripe for exploitation by everybody. Believing, of course, that in that free and open competition, the United States would be able to prevail. William Appleman Williams defined this open door policy as being the very basis of American foreign policy. It defined the way we dealt with the world in the 20th century. It determined the positions we would take on international squabbles between other nations in other areas of the world. The open door was always the sine qua non. It was always the basis on which we made our foreign policy choices. It was always our best interest, the open door. So how we behaved in international conflicts, who we sided with, would be determined principally by what decision was best to preserve the open door, which guaranteed that the world would remain open for American economic expansion, for the creation of new markets, potentially new sources of raw materials, and we would have an open nation based on free trade. In today's world, it seems to me, in the 21st century, the international trading agreements like NAFTA are the modern equivalents of John Hay's open door notes. And what we see in our campaign going on for President of the United States now are criticisms of these trade agreements, principally by Bernie Sanders, who is accusing Hillary Clinton of supporting most of these agreements, that in effect these international agreements have cost tens of thousands of American jobs, good quality American manufacturing jobs, because American industry found it lucrative to move into areas of the world where the cost of labor was so much cheaper. It was cheaper to do business. And right now, for example, Donald Trump is drawing a lot of attention because of his criticism of Carrier, which closed its manufacturing operation in Illinois and terminated the positions of 1,400 workers at Carrier's plant in Illinois because the company made the decision to move to Mexico. And so the issue now is what these international agreements, what this open door idea has done to American jobs. It has created a worldwide commercial environment where American companies have found in many cases that it's more lucrative to move their productive capabilities into areas of the world where the cost of labor, the cost of production is minimal. And it's decimating the middle class in this country. There's no question that these issues of international agreements, and of course right now the big one is the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, which does the same thing in Asia and in the Pacific that NAFTA did in this hemisphere. And President Obama's support for the so-called TPP is being criticized by progressives, by Bernie Sanders, because it's decimating American jobs. Obviously, President Obama and others in the administration, in the establishment, believe that this is very consistent with America's traditions of open door international trade and international commerce. The assumption being that by bringing these distant portions of the world into our training orbit, we are potentially creating markets for our manufactured goods, and we are ensuring that our market opportunities continue to expand. But it's happening clearly at the expense of our middle class, of our working people. I think many of the controversies today ought to be explained and understood by looking back at some of this history. And I believe it's very informative to realize that much of this history, much of the blueprint for the open door, is sketched out in Washington's farewell address, more specifically in the mind of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was an economic visionary. He saw the potential of the United States as an international economic power, provided it could strengthen its manufacturing capability to go along with its commercial capabilities. And the steps that he took in his financial program in the early 1790s were designed to bring the United States to the point of giving it the kind of economic flexibility that he believed would ultimately give us the opportunity to dominate the world economically. And we have done that. William Appleman Williams, in his Tragedy of American Diplomacy, kind of ripped the scab off the sore, so to speak. and showed the world exactly what was involved in these kinds of decisions, the good and the bad, the opportunities for the world, the education and civilizing of the world, as it were, by bringing it into the orbit of the developed capitalistic West, recognizing or assuming in the process that the cultural traditions that were being cast aside in the process were expendable. The idea was that we were doing the world a favor by bringing peoples of the world screaming and kicking into our world, even if they didn't want to come, because we didn't have any choice. Our future as a nation depended on the success of these kinds of international agreements and policies. I think all of this is evident in Washington's farewell address. I believe that that speech, that address, it's not really a speech. I don't believe he delivered it. I think he submitted it in writing to Congress. But there's absolutely no question that there's so much in that document about parties, about the assumption behind parties, about international affairs, about our relations with other nations. I think there's an awful lot to be learned about the future history of the United States by mining that document. And by mining it, what I mean is going into the ingredients, the contents of that document in depth, reading it critically, reading between the lines, seeing the implications of that particular document. We've just gone beyond the bottom of the hour. It's 32 minutes after the hour, so we're down to about 25 minutes or so left in our program today. I don't regret for one moment that we took an hour to look at some of that material, because I really do believe that it's critically important. A lot of it is basic stuff, it seems to me, but a lot of it is critically important. There's one piece of that story that I haven't really tied up, and I kind of don't want to leave it without doing that. And that's the portion of the story where at the very beginning I mentioned that colleges and universities used to feature foreign policy research. I believe that the discomfort created by William Appleman Williams and those who followed him, I mean, I'm not going to start naming names, but one of the ones that I can think of is Richard McCormick, who was a student of William Appleman Williams. One of my closest friends and colleagues, who has since passed, here in southern West Virginia, was Sidney Bell. Sid Bell studied with William Appleman Williams at the University of Wisconsin. When I went to the University of Wisconsin, William Appleman Williams was in his last year there before he moved on to the University of Oregon. I believe it was either Oregon or Oregon State. I'm not sure which. But he left Wisconsin. Sid Bell's dissertation was on Woodrow Wilson. And basically what Sid Bell ended up doing was applying the principles articulated so well by William Appleman Williams in his treatment of Wilson's foreign policy. The title of Sid Bell's dissertation, and ultimately the book that came from it, is Righteous Conquest. It seems to me that righteous conquest so accurately defines the foreign policy writings of William Appleman Williams, as well as the foreign policy priorities of Woodrow Wilson. Because Sid Bell argues that Woodrow Wilson captured the contradictions that William Appleman Williams discussed. Namely, Wilson's foreign policy was driven by the same expansionist desires that ultimately produced American imperialism internationally. And at the same time, Wilson was able to rationalize what he was doing with the suggestion that we were conducting foreign policy for the best interests of the peoples of the world who would be privileged enough to come into our orbit. In other words, what we were doing internationally was for their own good, as it were, the peoples of the world. They would be better off. Their lifestyle and standard of living would be enhanced because of what we were doing. It almost constituted the very nature, the definition of the tragedy that William Appleman Williams writes about in his Tragedy of American Diplomacy. I think Sid Bell's title, Righteous Conquest, is so absolutely incredibly appropriate. The subtitle of Bell's book, Righteous Conquest, Woodrow Wilson and the Evolution of the New Diplomacy. Sid's book was published in 1972 by Kennecott Press. I have a copy right in my hand. Sid taught and retired from Concord University here in southern West Virginia. And I think from everything I've heard, Sid Bell was probably more instrumental than anybody else in providing me the opportunity to come and teach at Concord University in the 1970s. He became a close friend as well as a colleague. And when he passed, I recognized that one of the brightest minds in the field of American history and foreign policy had left us. I still believe that. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. I would welcome the opportunity to interact with any of you that would like to get into the story a little bit more or react to it, because it's pretty controversial. A lot of people refuse to accept it. And I think the political fallout from the Williams thesis and from the tales of American foreign policy that became public as a result of William Appleman Williams and the books that he published. Contours of American History is another one. But Tragedy of American Diplomacy, it seems to me, is the key one. The fact of the matter is that as many of these foreign policy experts approached retirement, America's colleges and universities chose not to replace them with other diplomatic experts. After Vietnam, foreign policy ceased to be a major feature of the nation's top history departments. I really believe that Williams had such an impact on the nation's understanding of American foreign policy that many history departments in our colleges and universities made the decision that it was a little bit easier for them to not replace these foreign policy experts with other foreign policy experts. And gradually, foreign policy has faded out as a key feature of some of America's strongest history departments or history programs. In the history grant that we conducted earlier in the 21st century, we had two history grants, one from 2003 through 2006, the other one from 2009 up until 2013. And one of the things that I wanted to emphasize as part of these grants was foreign policy. I went to the University of Wisconsin, which has always been the source for the best in scholarship in American foreign policy, in search of a foreign policy expert in today's academic world. And my associate and longtime friend John Kaminsky gave me the name of Jeremy Surrey, who had been a diplomatic historian at the University of Wisconsin for 10 years before he transferred to the University of Texas in Austin. And I made the call to Jeremy Surrey and asked him if he would participate in our grant, and he did. And he made a couple of absolutely stellar presentations to our history teachers on American foreign policy, much of it based on his very prominent and well-received book called Liberty's Surest Guardian, which is American foreign policy priority of nation building in the late 20th and early 21st century. As America goes overseas and ceases to construct new nations modeled on the priorities and principles of American foreign policy, the assumption being that if our nation is surrounded by other nations whose priorities and values are similar to ours, we have the best chance of securing a world that remains at peace. Surrey's treatment of nation building in the world suggests that while we have some successes, we also have some failures. It's a book which I highly recommend. Liberty's Surest Guardian. And in his preface, Jeremy Surrey makes the point that America's commitment to the idea of nation building is part of America's DNA. That's the statement from the preface that I probably remember better than anything in Jeremy Surrey's book. So with that, I'd like to terminate our discussion of American foreign policy for a time. We've just reached 45 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 12 minutes left in our program. I wanted to share with you, I mentioned at the opening, the review of the musical Hamilton, which is getting such rave reviews on Broadway. It's sold out for months ahead of time. I don't know, what the opportunity, I know I would love to see it. But the criticism, and let me be specific. This is an article by Jennifer Schuessler, and the title is Hamilton and History, Are They in Sync? And Jennifer's thesis seems to be that there's a lot of criticism and conversation in the academic world over the historical accuracy of the musical Hamilton. The play, the musical, as developed, by the author who wrote the script, who wrote the score. And his last name is Miranda. I'm stuck for his first name, to be very honest with you. I've seen him interviewed on television a number of times. I saw him perform at the White House. Absolutely incredible talent. He plays Hamilton in it. He wrote the score. It's rap music. It's rap music with historical content. And one of the key features of the musical, as many of you may know, is that the leading characters are played by non-white actors and musicians, Hispanics and African Americans. Thomas Jefferson is played by an African American. And of course, the musical goes to great lengths to emphasize the hostility between Hamilton and Jefferson, principally built around Jefferson's support for and determination to keep slaves. And the debate that Schuessler talks about in her article is the extent to which the musical is overly kind to Hamilton because of his opposition to slavery, and is overly critical of Jefferson for the same reason. It's a very, very interesting piece, and it raises a lot of important questions, it seems to me. One of the key ones is the issue of artistic license. I think all of us need to recognize that art in the form of a Broadway musical in many ways has traditionally been exempt from sticking to the script, the historical script, as it were. Artists have traditionally been free to take license with their art in order to make it work in an artistic venue like a Broadway play. But one historian, for example, David Wallstreicher, who is a historian at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, when he addresses the play, makes reference to something he called founders chic. More specifically, what he calls the founders chic phenomenon, which he believes has allowed Hamilton the man to get a free pass in preference to Hamilton the musical. In other words, his criticism of the musical is that for artistic reasons, it makes Hamilton look a lot better and a lot more noble than he really was. Lyra Montero writes in The Public Historian about the use of African American and Hispanic actors to play the roles in what is really historically an all-white affair. The fact of the matter is that the Congresses at that time were all male and all white. And to depict these characters with Hispanic and African American actors and musicians is what Lyra Montero calls, an amazing piece of theater. But she said, it concerns me that people are seeing it as a piece of history. They're assuming that it's historically accurate, when in fact it is far from that. We've gone a long way here in the Virtual Center by looking at specific Federalist papers that Hamilton wrote We know quite a bit about Hamilton, the man, the person, the politician. We know about his economic priorities. We know about the way he looked at government. We're familiar with the speech that he delivered in the Constitutional Convention on the 16th of June, 1787, in which he praised the British monarchical system and made the prediction that the only thing that could work in America is a monarchy. He wanted a president elected for life. He didn't believe that Republican government could work, that it would be stable enough, that it would protect private property enough. Hamilton may have come from extremely modest foreign background, but there's no question he became an elitist. He was an elitist. He advocated government by the few, not the many. And the fact of the matter is, in order to support the Constitution and the Republican government it created, we find in Hamilton a number of important contradictions between what he felt like he had to say in order to support ratification of the Constitution and what he really believed, which was the Constitution was not strong enough to preserve the kind of stability that America needed at the time. So there's absolutely no question that Hamilton the man is not the noble character that is portrayed in the musical. And that's a concern to a lot of people. I'll be honest with you, I would love to see the musical. I want to see it as a musical. One of the most exhilarating experiences of my life was the musical 1776, which is available on video. I've seen that at least 10 times. I love it. I love the portrayal of the characters. I appreciate the degree to which the writers of that musical made every effort to depict the characters as historical research suggested they were. John Adams, the elitist. John Adams, the arrogant. John Adams, the person who seemed to rub people the wrong way all the time. The contrast between John Adams, the elitist, and Benjamin Franklin, the consummate politician who became whatever the situation called for. He was sophisticated when it called for sophistication. He was down to earth when the situation called for down to earth. The musical Hamilton is based on the biography of Alexander Hamilton, written by Ron Chernow. Ron Chernow wrote a detailed study of Vietnam, called Vietnam, the Vietnam War. In his biography of Hamilton, he emphasizes the rags to riches aspect of Hamilton's career, that he came here as a penniless immigrant from the Caribbean, and that he rose into a position of dominance and power through what Chernow calls sheer brilliance and drive. That biography is what Miranda used as the model for the musical. Chernow's treatment of Hamilton is quite generous. And I think we need to realize that. Chernow made a comment about the musical and said, "This show is the best advertisement for racial diversity in Broadway history, and it's sad that it's being attacked on racial grounds." Chernow's criticism of the musical is based on the idea that we are not appreciating the value of the musical in terms of promoting the idea of racial diversity. That's one of the things that I would say as well. It seems to me that we have to be careful not to become too critical and thereby lose sight of the value of the musical as a musical. Because from everything I've seen, it's an incredible piece of artistic brilliance. There's one comment at the end of this review that I wanted to share with you. And it's by a historian at City College of New York named R.B. Bernstein. Bernstein says something that he believes is associated with the musical and is not being appreciated. And I tend to agree with him. He said it's about how hard it is to do politics, about how people of fundamentally clashing political views tried to work together to create a shared constitutional enterprise. Right now, he says, that's a message we really need. We're living in a world right now where it seems in our politics that nobody's able to get along with anybody. That our politics is so polarized, so divisive, so hostile. Civility seems to have become a thing of the past. This campaign borders on the abysmal, it seems to me. The violence at rallies, the criticism by one candidate of another's wife. It seems to me that this campaign is revealing an awful lot of what's wrong in American politics today. And if you look at the musical Hamilton from that perspective, what Miranda has given us is a musical that portrays people from different parts of the country and different backgrounds who are trying to come up with something that works. I think we're tending to overlook that. I think Bernstein's right. I think we're tending to overlook the positives associated with this. And maybe we're going at it with a meat cleaver when we ought not to do that. But anyway, if you do get the opportunity to go back to the New York Times yesterday and look at this op-ed piece, this article that's in there by Jennifer Schlusser, I think you'll enjoy it. We're at the end of our program today. It's 58 minutes after the hour. I'd like to thank you for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network and of this particular program, the Virtual Center. Thank you for being with us today. I invite you back tomorrow. We'll be starting at our regular time tomorrow, which will be 1 p.m. We'll have our full 2-hour program, as we usually do on Wednesdays. This is Bill O'Brien. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Enjoy, be kind to each other, and thank you.